It started like any other quiet afternoon in our neighborhood, the kind where you can hear the birds more than the traffic. My wife was at home, enjoying her day off, when there was a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, so she decided not to answer. Simple, right? But in an HOA community, nothing is ever that simplest, especially when there's a Karen living down the street down. Now, this wasn't just an ordinary knock-and-walk situation. The HOA Karen, always eager to control what everyone else does, decided my wife's choice to ignore the door was some kind of offense. Instead of letting it go, she took things to an extreme no one saw coming. She actually called 911. Imagine that tan emergency line. All because someone didn't answer a knock on their own front door. The officers who arrived must have expected trouble. Maybe even a dangerous situation. What they found instead was my wife calmly sitting inside, confused at all the commotion outside her own home. But here's the twist that made this story unforgettable. The caller had no idea who she was dealing with. My wife wasn't just another neighbor. She wasn't just another HOA target. She had recently taken on a brand new role in our city, one that changed the entire dynamic of what was about to unfold. Because the woman she called the police on wasn't just anyone. She was the brand new chief of police. And the look on Karen's face when that truth came out, well, let's just say that's when this story really begins. Neighbors in our community already knew Karen's reputation. She had a way of turning the smallest things into full-blown problems, whether it was a trash can left out too long, grass growing half an inch too high, or a car parked slightly off-center. She lived for rules, and more than that, for enforcing them in her own dramatic style. What no one expected was that she'd take her obsession this far. Using 911 as if it were her personal complaint line, my wife, on the other hand, had only recently moved into this position of authority. She kept a low profile in the neighborhood, never flaunting who she was or what job she held. To most people, she was simply the friendly new neighbor who waved while walking the dog. She wanted it that way, choosing peace at home instead of bringing her work into every interaction. But by the time the squad cars pulled up in front of our house, that boundary between her personal life and her professional role was about to disappear. When the officers stepped out, you could see the confusion on their faces. They expected to walk into a situation where someone might be in danger, not a calm suburban home where the supposed victim was sitting safely inside. Karen, standing proudly at the edge of her driveway, wasted no time filling the air with her story, painting herself as the hero who had saved the neighborhood from some supposed threat. The irony was almost painful. She was completely unaware that the very woman she was trying to report was the one who outranked every officer now standing on that street. The tension in the air was almost visible. Karen stood with her arms crossed, nodding smugly as the officers tried to piece together why they had even been called. She spoke loudly enough for the entire street to hear, claiming that ignoring a knock at the door was suspicious behavior and a sign that something illegal might be happening inside. To her, it wasn't about safety, it was about control. About proving that she had the power to dictate how neighbors lived in their own homes. From the porch, my wife finally stepped outside. She kept her tone calm, professional, almost too steady for the situation. The officers recognized her immediately, and their body language shifted. But instead of announcing who she was, she let the scene play out, observing how Karen would dig her own hole deeper. It was a strange moment watching an HOA neighbor try to instruct law enforcement on what should be done, while unknowingly lecturing the new chief of police standing only a few feet away. Meanwhile, other neighbors began peeking out of their windows and drifting closer, curious about the flashing lights and raised voices. Some whispered quietly, already tired of Karen's endless drama, while others leaned in to catch every word. It wasn't just about this single incident anymore. It was about a pattern of behavior that had finally boiled over into something bigger inside. I was torn between stepping in to support my wife and staying back to let her handle it her way. She had dealt with far more intense conflicts in her career, but this was different. This was her home. And Karen had just turned it into a stage for her power games. Karen's voice grew sharper as she pointed toward our house, insisting that the officers do their job and force my wife to explain herself. She accused her of being uncooperative, of hiding something, even going so far as to claim she had seen strange activity around our property. The words sounded desperate, almost rehearsed, like she had been waiting for the perfect moment to make a scene. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly aware this wasn't the emergency they had been called for, but still trapped by procedure in the middle of an escalating spectacle. My wife stood silently for a moment, letting the weight of Karen's accusations hang in the air. The crowd of neighbors had now grown larger, phones quietly raised as people began recording. The flashing red and blue lights bounced across the street, giving the whole scene an intensity it didn't deserve but couldn't shake. Every second built more pressure, and still, Karen showed no signs of backing down. She doubled down instead, raising her voice and demanding the officers remove my wife from her own front porch. The officers shifted uncomfortably, caught between appeasing a loud HOA member and the quiet authority they could feel radiating from the woman in front of them. My wife's calm composure only made Karen's shouting look more unhinged. Neighbors whispered nervously, wondering how long this would drag out, while others leaned forward as if waiting for a sudden explosion. And then, in the middle of Karen's rant, my wife finally stepped forward, locking eyes with the officers. The moment was thick with tension. Everyone knew something was about to give. But no one could predict just how quickly the balance of power on that street was about to flip. Just as my wife opened her mouth to speak, another voice cut through the noise. A man from across the street, one of the newer residents in the neighborhood. He stepped forward, pointing directly at Karen, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "This isn't the first time she's done this." Suddenly, the spotlight shifted. All eyes turned to him as he explained how Karen had called the police on him months earlier for having contractors parked near her yard, claiming it was a security risk. The officers froze, clearly caught off guard. This wasn't just one petty call anymore. This was a pattern, a string of false reports all tied to the same person. The neighbors murmured, some nodding in agreement as stories began spilling out. A family down the street mentioned Karen harassing them over a basketball hoop. Another neighbor said she'd threatened to fine them for leaving their porch light on too late. What began as a single confrontation was unraveling into something much bigger: history of abuse, of power that everyone had quietly endured until now. Karen's face flushed as she tried to shout over them, insisting everyone else was lying, but the damage was done. Her authority, the little power she clung to through HOA rules and intimidation, was slipping away in front of the very people she had controlled for years. The officers shifted again, their attention moving back and forth between Karen and my wife. And that's when my wife finally stepped forward, her calm voice steady but carrying enough weight to silence the crowd. What she said next was about to change everything. The street fell into silence as my wife finally spoke. She looked directly at the officers and, with calm authority, introduced herself not as just a resident, not as someone caught in Karen's latest drama, but as the new chief of police. For a moment, the weight of those words seemed to hang in the air. The officers straightened instantly, their entire demeanor shifting with the realization. The neighbors gasped, some whispering in disbelief, others smiling as if justice had finally walked right into their cold-d-sack. Karen, however, didn't take the news quietly. Her face turned red and she sputtered, accusing my wife of lying, of somehow pretending just to embarrass her. But the officers quickly confirmed it, nodding respectfully toward my wife. That confirmation broke whatever fragile ground Karen had left to stand on. The woman who had called 911 to flex her control had, without even realizing it, placed herself at the mercy of the very person she wanted removed. For a moment, it seemed like the story would end right there, with Karen humiliated, the neighborhood relieved, and the conflict resolved. But then came the twist no one expected. One of the officers quietly informed my wife, in front of everyone, that Karen's call hadn't just gone to dispatch, had been flagged. Because of her repeated false reports, the HOA Karen was already under investigation for misusing emergency services. This 911 stunt was the last straw. The crowd erupted in whispers. Karen's attempt to shame her neighbor had backfired so completely that it had exposed her own actions. And as the flashing lights lit up her stunned face, it became clear the balance of power in the neighborhood had shifted forever. The neighborhood stayed gathered long after the lights from the patrol cars stopped flashing. People who had never spoken up before were finally sharing their stories, each one adding to the realization that Karen's behavior had been a burden for far too long. What had started as one call over a door left unanswered had pulled back the curtain on years of intimidation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. She had tried to use authority to scare others. But in the end, it exposed her own misuse of power. For my wife, the situation confirmed something she already believed deeply, that leadership isn't about control. It's about protecting people and standing up for fairness. She didn't gloat, didn't lecture, and didn't need to prove herself with threats. Instead, she simply reminded everyone, neighbors and officers alike, that 911 was for emergencies, not for petty disputes or personal grudges. Her words carried weight not just because of her position, but because they came from someone who valued respect over ego. In the days that followed, the HOA atmosphere shifted. Neighbors began talking more, finding common ground where before there had only been quiet resentment. And while Karen faded into the background, her influence broken, the street found a kind of peace it hadn't felt in years. The whole incident left us with a reminder that communities thrive not on rules and punishments, but on trust and understanding. When people misuse authority, they eventually collapse under their own weight. But when leadership comes from patience and integrity, it has the power to change not just a moment, but an entire neighborhood.